Margaret Campbell, the Duchess of Argyll, had a secret locked drawer in her home. When her husband finally broke into it, the contents shocked him and the world. Margaret Wigham's young life set her up for her raucous adulthood. Born to a Scottish millionaire, she grew up in New York City and attended some of the most exclusive private schools in the country, alongside some of the best, brightest and wealthiest heirs and heiresses of her day. But she was seemingly drawn to scandal from a young age. By the time Margaret was 15 years old, men were already going crazy for her striking beauty. Must have been those Scottish genes. And she soon came to enjoy all the attention. In the summer of 1928, Margaret caught the eye of an older boy, the 18-year-old David Niven, who later became Hollywood actor David Niven. And speaking of Hollywood, what these two got up to was worthy of a dramatic screenplay. David Niven met Margaret while the two of them were on holiday on the Isle of Wight. It was the perfect recipe for disaster. With their parents and chaperones otherwise occupied with their own vacation, the teenagers managed to find ample time to explore their personal landscapes. Although Margaret's experiences with Niven were her first time with a man, one time in her case was very much enough. She got supremely unlucky and months later discovered she was pregnant. 1928 was a terrifying time to be an unwed mother. So Margaret took drastic action. She told her parents all about her liaison with Niven and the pregnancy. As one maid who worked for the family put it, all hell broke loose at that point. Her father in particular was beside himself with rage, but as soon as they were over the initial shock, Margaret's parents knew exactly what they had to do. Her family was eminently respectable, and they couldn't have a whisper of their daughter's so-called disgrace. Accordingly, they packed her up and sent her to a London nursing home where attendants performed a very hush-hush operation to terminate the pregnancy. It was so secret that Margaret didn't even mention it in her memoirs published nearly 50 years later. Just 2 years after this episode, Margaret pulled a fast one on society. In 1930, her parents presented her at court as a debutante, which was basically their way of saying she was ready to mingle with men and get married. Margaret had only grown more beautiful as the years passed, and by the end of the season, the court named her their debutante of the year, and she had her pick of suitors. Unfortunately, when it came to Margaret, having so many romantic options was always going to mean trouble. Around this time, Margaret's behaviour behind the scenes sent tongues wagging. Namely, although she was ostensibly looking for marriage and stability, she sure wasn't acting like it. The beautiful girl entertained flirtations and more from high-powered men like Prince Ali Khan and daring aviator Glenn Kidston. Although Prince Ali Khan loved to shower Margaret with affection and gifts, it was Kidston who really took her fancy, even though he was the most dangerous of all. After all, the flyboy was already married and had a young toddler at home. Still, Margaret dove in headfirst anyway, solidifying her reputation as something of a Helen of Troy. However, before this affair could do irreparable damage to Kidston's family life, disaster came knocking. In the spring of 1931, Margaret's carefree life came to an abrupt halt. That May, she got word that her lover, Glenn Kidston, had perished in a horrific plane crash. He'd been flying through a dust storm when his entire plane broke apart beneath him. Margaret was utterly devastated, but she didn't deal with her grief in the best of ways. Rebounding from a breakup is always risky, and Margaret was rebounding from a full-blown tragedy. Following Kidston's death, she got hastily engaged to Charles Greville, the uber-wealthy Earl of Warwick, and accepted the proposal of another man, the publishing heir Max Aiken, near simultaneously. And that wasn't even the most scandalous part. Instead of going for either Greville or Aiken, she dumped them both and went with another man entirely, the businessman and avid golfer Charles. What she got was a nightmare. As a teenager, Margaret had gotten pregnant all too easily. But when she tried to have children with Sweeney, it resulted in a heartbreaking 8 miscarriages. And when she did finally become pregnant for more than a few months, it somehow got worse. In late 1933, Margaret was 8 months pregnant and readying herself to give birth at last. But it wasn't meant to be. Tragically, her baby girl was stillborn. Despite this devastation, Margaret tried again, eventually having 2 children with Sweeney by 1940. But her difficulties left lasting psychological scars. Then, in 1943, everything changed once more. When she was in her late 20s, Margaret was visiting her doctor on Bond Street when she fell a whopping 40 feet down an elevator shaft in a freak accident. From that point on, nothing would be the same again. When the dust cleared, luck prevailed. Rescuers located Margaret, and miraculously she was still alive. But there were disturbing indications of what really happened. As Margaret recalled, doctors thought she must have grabbed onto the elevator cable. This is what likely saved her life, because her fingernails were torn and bloody. After 33 stitches to her head and days spent recovering, doctors allowed Margaret to go home to her family. But according to her husband, the woman who returned was not the wife he had known before. Instead, Margaret had become erratic and impulsive, with nymphomaniac tendencies. Looking back, this may have been the point it all began to unravel. To achieve. Among her conquests was a broken engagement with the Texan banker Joseph Thomas, as well as a dalliance with the curator for the Met, Theodore Rousseau. But these boys were just practice for the man she was about to meet. Soon after untangling herself from these brief encounters, Margaret met the man who would ruin her life. Ian Duncan Campbell, the dashing Scottish peer known as the Duke of Argyll, sure fit the part. With a forbidding face and a brusque manner, Campbell seemed every bit a Byronic hero, and Margaret fell head over heels. Campbell even had a crumbling abode in Inverary Castle to match his moodiness. While Margaret had been married once before when she met the Duke, he had already gone through 2 wives, and his track record was far from reassuring. He was a troubled man, traumatised from his time spent as a prisoner of war in Germany during World War II. As a result, he was a notorious drinker and gambler, and was hooked on prescription medications to boot. More than that, both of his previous wives claimed he had mistreated them. In short, Margaret should have run away. Instead, she ran right towards him. Margaret married Ian Campbell in March of 1951 and became the Duchess of Argyll in the process. On the surface, it looked like she was on top of the world. She was the belle of yet another society wedding, she had a title and a powerful husband, and people still considered her one of the best-dressed women in the world. But behind the scenes, she was already living a horror story. Marrying Ian Campbell was like signing a deal with the devil, and the Duke made sure Margaret knew it before the ink on their marriage contract was even dry. In a move he had likely pulled before, Campbell began siphoning off the money that Margaret brought into the union to restore his ancestral seat at Inverary Castle. To him, she was just a bank account. Then again, right around this time, Margaret went off the deep end herself. Traumatic elevator accident or not, Margaret's personality had always been odd. Even her friends thought she completely lacked a sense of humour, and she called herself a bird brain. As someone who self-identified as always vain, Margaret always cared much more about her beauty than anything else. Within just a few months of marrying the Duke, Margaret had already realised she'd made a mistake. She may have been one of the most beautiful women of her generation, but to the Duke, she was just another wife he could intimidate, push around, and demean. On top of that, Margaret was having further difficulty giving him a child, which didn't help matters. At the end of her rope, she came up with a diabolical plan. Reportedly, the Duchess began taking aim at the Duke's sons from his previous marriage, even going so far as to forge letters that claimed the boys were illegitimate. It was a failed ploy to safeguard her own power. Margaret learned the hard way that money can't buy you happiness, but in some cases it can buy you a child, and that's apparently what she tried to do. Her plan? She was going to take the child in and somehow pass him off as her own, therefore making him the true, legitimate heir of the Duke. Nope, doesn't make any sense to me either, but then I've never fell 40 feet down an elevator shaft. The Duke of Argyll had always been suspicious that his wife had a roaming eye, but he'd never quite been able to prove it. So when Margaret started staying out extra late and getting more distant, the Duke committed a creepy breach of trust. He had Margaret's car wiretapped so he could know where she was all the time. Still, that wasn't quite enough for him. His next idea would be the couple's downfall. Starting in the late 1950s, the Duke of Argyll had enough of waiting for his wife to get home. Plus, there was another disconcerting sign. Margaret had a locked drawer in their home, and his dark fantasies about its contents drove him mad. So one day, while she was away in New York and he had ample time to sit and get more paranoid, he called a locksmith and asked him to break into it. Years ago, if you'll remember, Margaret's first husband, Charles Sweeney, claimed that her fall down an elevator shaft had fundamentally changed her personality and turned her into a nymphomaniac. The contents of her locked cupboard revealed the whole sordid truth. In it, among other things, was a set of extremely damning and risque Polaroid photographs. To describe these Polaroids in a video like this, which is supposed to be educational and not salacious, is a Herculean task. After all, some of the photographs depicted intensely intimate positions with Margaret completely undressed, and although her face was usually obscured, the Duke could recognise her by one telltale sign: her favourite necklace made up of 3 strings of pearls. In the photographs, the Duchess of Argyll was very much not alone. Indeed, she was seen to be performing acts on men who were very much not the Duke of Argyll. Frustratingly enough, and key to everything that followed, the men's faces were often out of frame, making them impossible to identify. Upon finding this evidence, the Duke of Argyll turned right around and started divorce proceedings against Margaret. In his court papers, the Duke accused Margaret of sleeping with no fewer than 88 men over the course of their marriage. With this, the floodgates opened. In light of her husband's allegations and jaw-dropping evidence, Margaret couldn't just sit back and take it. Instead, she accused him of a heinous act. In a countersuit, she claimed that the Duke had been unfaithful too, but not with just anyone. She claimed he had slept with her own stepmother, Jane Corby Wigham. Margaret seemed poised to take the Duke down with her, but on the very day of her hearing about his infidelity, she couldn't find a witness and had to drop her case. Over the 4 years that Margaret and her Duke were facing off against each other in court, the press speculated wildly about all of Margaret's sins, dubbing her the Dirty Duchess. Because Margaret's private stash of photos was now public evidence, newspapers of the day got a full view of the single most infamous snap in Margaret's collection. One where she was kneeling down in front of a headless man. Now, he wasn't actually headless, just the photo cropped his head out. Incredibly, his identity was still a mystery after all this time, and journalists tried to guess who he might be. In doing so, they dug up even more dirt on the Duchess. With 88 possible lovers to choose from, the press had a field day hunting down the man in the picture. One man who kept popping up in Margaret's history was the Minister of Defence for Britain, Duncan Sandys, who would also go on to become Winston Churchill's son-in-law. Whether or not Sandys was the headless man, he was certainly a lover of Margaret's and offered his resignation when the scandal broke.
How to add sweetness to your life? When you want a snack or prepare for the holiday parties, don't forget this cookie for you and your family. They are so delicious. Also, these cookies are keto-friendly and vegan. Each cookie only has a few grams of sugar. Perfect for adding a little bit of sweetness to your life.